The 3rd of April 2026, a date that will likely be studied for decades in military academies around the world, not as a day of Russian triumph, but as a catastrophic turning point. What was supposed to be Vladimir Putin's grand summer offensive, a massive, war-winning armored thrust designed to shatter Ukrainian defensive lines once and for all, has instead ended in what military analysts are already calling the single deadliest defeat for Russian ground forces since the Second World War. In a span of just 72 hours, across the open farmlands of southern and eastern Ukraine, the Kremlin's long-awaited mechanized hammer has been reduced to a field of smoldering wreckage. This is not a story of a close fight or a tactical setback. This is the story of a complete and utter armor massacre. And at the heart of this devastating reversal is a counterintelligence and tactical hunting strategy so uniquely effective, so ruthlessly intelligent, that it has fundamentally altered the calculus of the war. Ukraine has not simply stopped the offensive. It has found a genius way to hunt Russian troops, creating a kill zone from which there is genuinely no escape. To understand the scale of what has just unfolded, one must first understand Russian military doctrine. For 3 years, Moscow has cycled through phases of attritional infantry pushes, artillery barrages, and aerial bombardment. But the strategy unveiled on the morning of March 30th was different. It was a return to the Soviet deep battle concept, a coordinated assault by over 500 main battle tanks, nearly 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and an estimated 40,000 fresh troops. The objective was the capture of the remaining Ukrainian strongholds in Donetsk and a deep penetration westward toward the Dnipro River. Satellite imagery captured by Maxar and Planet Labs showed columns stretching for over 15 kilometers, a river of steel and armor flowing toward Ukrainian positions. Russian state media, in those first hours, broadcast images of the advance with triumphant music, declaring the beginning of the final act. But those broadcasts would soon go silent. The columns rolled directly into a trap. What happened on the ground is a brutal lesson in modern warfare. Ukrainian forces, using a network of long-range drones, forward observers, and what intelligence sources now confirm was a deeply compromised Russian command network, knew the exact timing and axis of the attack a full 48 hours before the first tank moved. This was not luck. This was the result of a systematic hunting methodology. Ukrainian military intelligence, working in conjunction with a decentralized network of civilian tech operators and partisan reconnaissance cells, had spent months mapping every possible avenue of approach. They identified the choke points, the river crossings, and the tree lines that Russian doctrine traditionally uses for concealment. Then, they did something unprecedented. Instead of massing their own armor for a conventional counterattack, they dispersed their most lethal assets into small, highly mobile hunter-killer teams. Each team was equipped with first-person view drones, loitering munitions, and advanced anti-tank guided missiles. But the genius was not in the weapons themselves. The genius was in the coordination. As the Russian spearheads advanced, they encountered almost no immediate resistance. For the first 6 hours, the columns moved rapidly, covering nearly 20 kilometers in some sectors. This was deliberate. The Ukrainian command, led by General Alexander Syrsky, allowed the Russians to enter a pre-designated killing zone. The terrain was carefully chosen. It was flat, open farmland, offering no natural cover, bordered on 2 sides by small rivers that had swelled with spring rains, creating a natural water obstacle. Once the main body of the Russian assault force was committed, once the tanks were bogged down in the soft, muddy soil that had turned into a quagmire due to recent unseasonable weather, the trap was sprung. From 3 directions, Ukrainian artillery, including precision-guided Excalibur rounds and long-range rocket systems, began a creeping barrage. But the artillery was not the primary killer. It was the drone swarms. In a coordinated attack that resembled a swarm of hornets descending on a larger animal, over 1,000 Ukrainian drones took to the air simultaneously. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Russian tank commanders, trained to fight in a linear, hierarchical structure, found themselves unable to communicate. The electronic warfare systems that Moscow had deployed to jam Ukrainian frequencies were overwhelmed by the sheer number of signals. For every drone that was shot down, 3 more appeared. The footage that has emerged from the battlefield, verified by open-source intelligence accounts, is nothing short of apocalyptic. T-90M tanks, Russia's most advanced main battle tanks, are struck on their turret tops, the thinnest armor, by shaped charges dropped from quadcopters. Infantry fighting vehicles are incinerated as precision loitering munitions fly directly into their open hatches. Columns that had been advancing in orderly formation descend into chaos. Vehicles crash into one another. Crews abandon their armored hulls, only to be hunted by smaller observation drones that guide mortar fire directly onto their positions. The concept of a linear front line has dissolved. The entire battlefield has become a single continuous kill box. The human cost, while impossible to independently verify in real time, is estimated by Western military intelligence to be staggering. In just 2 days of active combat, Russia is believed to have lost over 300 main battle tanks and 400 armored vehicles. The number of personnel killed, wounded, or captured is estimated to exceed 8,000. To put that number in perspective, it is roughly the equivalent of an entire Russian combined arms army being erased from the order of battle. This is not a defeat measured in meters of retreat. This is a defeat measured in the annihilation of combat power. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, operating behind the collapsing Russian lines, have captured dozens of Russian soldiers who report a complete breakdown in command. One prisoner, a sergeant from a motorized rifle brigade, told his captors that his battalion commander was killed in the first hour by a drone strike. He said there was no order to retreat, no order to advance, only the sound of explosions and the screams of men trapped inside burning vehicles. The strategic implications of this defeat are already rippling across the global political landscape. For months, Western allies had been debating the delivery of advanced fighter aircraft and longer-range missiles, with some arguing that Ukraine should focus only on defensive operations to conserve manpower. This victory has silenced those voices overnight. The United States Department of Defense, in an emergency briefing late last night, confirmed that it is accelerating the delivery of additional ammunition and armored vehicles. But more importantly, the defeat exposes a fundamental vulnerability in the Russian military machine that has not been seen since the collapse of the Tsarist army in 1917. The Russian system, reliant on centralized planning, rigid command structures, and overwhelming mass, has proven incapable of adapting to a battlefield that is transparent, fluid, and dominated by intelligent, autonomous sensors. The Kremlin's response has been telling. State television has stopped all live coverage of the war. Pro-war bloggers, usually the most vocal cheerleaders of the military, are in open revolt, demanding the resignation of Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Economically, the impact is equally severe. Russia had spent the past year rebuilding its armored forces, pulling T-62 tanks from deep storage and ramping up production at the Eurovagonzavod plant. This offensive was meant to justify those expenditures, to show the Russian public that the sacrifices of wartime mobilization were yielding tangible results. Instead, the Kremlin now faces a crisis of confidence. The ruble has weakened sharply against the dollar and the euro. Bond yields are rising, reflecting investor fears that the war is entering a new, more costly phase. And critically, the losses of equipment are irreplaceable in the short term. While Russia retains a deep reservoir of older tanks, it has lost a disproportionate number of its modern, battle-ready T-90M and T-80BVM models. These are not just vehicles. They represent years of production, billions of dollars, and the lives of trained crews. Without those crews, the hulks of older tanks are little more than steel coffins. Socially, inside Russia, the shock is beginning to manifest in quiet but noticeable ways. Recruitment centers, which had seen a steady flow of volunteers attracted by high signing bonuses, are now reporting a sharp drop in enlistments. The narrative of an unstoppable Russian army, of a force that grinds down the enemy through sheer will and firepower, has been shattered by video evidence that is impossible to censor. Despite the Kremlin's best efforts to block social media, footage of burning T-90s and columns of abandoned vehicles is spreading through Telegram channels viewed by millions of Russians. The unspoken contract between the state and the people, that the leadership will not send men to die in hopeless battles, has been broken. Mothers and wives are beginning to organize, not as political activists, but as desperate women demanding answers about the fate of their sons and husbands. The Kremlin's strategy of insulating the population from the reality of the war has failed. The reality is now streaming directly onto their phones. The international reaction to the defeat has been swift and devoid of the usual diplomatic hedging. In Brussels, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte convened an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council not to discuss escalation, but to discuss how to capitalize on the Russian collapse. For the first time since the invasion began, the alliance has publicly acknowledged that the balance of artillery firepower, long tilted in Russia's favor, has shifted decisively toward Ukraine. Western intelligence assessments, leaked to major news organizations, suggest that Russia has lost over 40% of its operational artillery tubes in the southern sector alone. This is not a temporary setback. It is a structural rupture. In London, the British Ministry of Defense released a rare midday intelligence update stating that Russian forces are now in a generalized retreat along a 70-kilometer front, abandoning not just forward positions but also logistics depots, field hospitals, and command centers. The speed of the collapse has surprised even the most optimistic Ukrainian planners. What was intended as a defensive battle to bleed the Russian offensive has become a full-scale rout. But the deeper story, the one that military analysts will dissect for years, is the hunting methodology Ukraine has perfected. This is not simply about drones. The genius lies in what Ukrainian commanders call the reactive kill chain. Traditionally, an army identifies a target, processes the information, authorizes a strike, and then executes. That process can take minutes or hours. Ukraine has reduced it to seconds. Using a mesh network of artificial intelligence-assisted target recognition software, observation drones no longer need to send video back to a human operator for analysis. The software identifies a Russian tank, an infantry cluster, or a supply truck instantly. It then automatically prioritizes the target and relays the coordinates to the nearest available strike drone or artillery piece. A human still makes the final firing decision, but the time between detection and destruction has collapsed from minutes to under 10 seconds. This is why the Russian columns could not react. By the time a Russian crew heard the warning beep of their laser warning receiver, the munition was already in its terminal dive. The escape routes that Russian commanders had planned for a tactical withdrawal were also compromised. In a move that has been described as a masterstroke of psychological warfare, Ukrainian intelligence had, months earlier, mapped every planned logistical route and fallback position. When the surviving Russian vehicles attempted to flee south toward the occupied city of Melitopol, they found the roads blocked by pre-sighted minefields and anti-tank ditches that had been dug under the cover of darkness by Ukrainian engineering teams. When they attempted to flee east toward Donetsk, they encountered brigades of Ukrainian mechanized infantry that had been held in reserve, not to attack, but to block the exits. The result is a pocket. A massive, fluid pocket containing thousands of Russian troops, hundreds of vehicles, and no way out. A Ukrainian official, speaking on condition of anonymity, compared the situation to a cauldron battle from the Eastern Front of the Second World War. But unlike those historic battles, there is no possibility of a breakout. Every tree line, every building, every road junction is under constant surveillance by drones that never tire, never blink, and never negotiate. The question of what comes next is no longer academic. With the Russian offensive shattered and its reserves committed, Ukraine faces a strategic opportunity that has not existed since the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022. However, the Ukrainian High Command is proceeding with extreme caution. General Syrskyi, in a rare public address, warned that while the situation is favorable, Russia retains significant strategic depth and the ability to launch new attacks after a pause. But the battlefield reality suggests that a pause is precisely what Russia cannot afford. The losses in this single operation exceed the total armored losses of the entire first year of the war. The Russian military is now in the unenviable position of having to defend a 1,000-kilometer front line with forces that are demoralized, depleted, and increasingly reliant on poorly trained, mobilized personnel. Open-source intelligence analysts have noted a dramatic increase in Russian military radio traffic that is unencrypted and panicked. Soldiers are reporting directly to their families, bypassing their officers. Command and control has, in many sectors, simply ceased to function. From a geopolitical perspective, the defeat has reshuffled the calculus in capitals around the world. In Beijing, Chinese officials are reportedly re-evaluating their support for Moscow. While China continues to provide economic lifelines, the spectacle of Russian armor burning on Ukrainian fields does not inspire confidence in a long-term investment. In New Delhi, Indian strategists, who have maintained a delicate balance of purchasing Russian oil while deepening ties with the West, are now accelerating plans to diversify their military procurement away from Russian systems. Even in Tehran, which has supplied Moscow with thousands of Shahed drones, there is concern that the export performance of Russian weaponry is damaging the brand of Iranian-made equipment. The drones supplied by Iran have been effective, but they have not been able to overcome the Ukrainian counter-drone network, which has also evolved dramatically. Ukraine is now deploying its own long-range drones, capable of striking targets deep inside Russia, including the oil refineries that fuel the Russian war machine. The human dimension of this battle cannot be forgotten beneath the weight of strategic analysis. The Russian soldiers who remain trapped in the pocket are facing a nightmare of existential proportions. With no resupply, dwindling ammunition, and no prospect of reinforcement, morale has collapsed. Ukrainian psychological operations units are broadcasting messages over loudspeakers and on Russian military radio frequencies, offering safe passage to those who surrender. The messages include detailed instructions on how to approach Ukrainian positions, what to do with weapons, and the rights that prisoners of war are guaranteed under the Geneva Conventions. In the first 12 hours of the broadcast, Ukrainian forces reported receiving over 200 individual Russian soldiers who walked out of the pocket with their hands raised. Some carried white flags fashioned from bed sheets and uniform scraps. Others came in small groups, carrying their wounded on stretchers made from branches and torn canvas. These are not the hardened professionals of the initial invasion force. These are the remnants of a broken army. Ukrainian losses, while significantly lighter, are not zero. The counter-drone operations and the artillery duels have taken a toll. At least 50 Ukrainian soldiers have been confirmed killed in the initial days of the offensive, mostly from Russian artillery strikes that landed before the counter-battery fire silenced the guns. Medics at Frontline stabilization points report a steady stream of wounded, many suffering from blast injuries and shrapnel wounds. But the ratio of losses, estimated at 1 Ukrainian for every 20 Russian, is unprecedented in modern conventional warfare. This is the math of annihilation, not attrition, and it is this math that has transformed the strategic calculus. For the first time, Ukrainian commanders are openly discussing the possibility of not just repelling the offensive, but of liberating significant territories, including possibly the city of Tokmak, a key railway hub, and threatening the land bridge to Crimea. The response from the Kremlin has been a study in cognitive dissonance. President Putin has not appeared in public since the disaster began. His annual address to the Federal Assembly, scheduled for this week, has been postponed without explanation. The state-controlled media machine has pivoted to domestic stories, focusing on infrastructure projects and the upcoming Victory Day celebrations. But the silence is deafening. Pro-war Telegram channels, which have long served as a pressure valve for nationalist anger, are now calling for a general mobilization, a full nationalization of the economy, and the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The Kremlin has so far rejected these calls, recognizing that general mobilization would be politically destabilizing and that nuclear escalation carries risks that even the current leadership is unwilling to accept. But the pressure is mounting. The Russian military command is desperately scraping together reserves, pulling troops from the Kherson sector and even from the occupied territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are not elite units. They are conscripts, border guards, and police forces being thrown into the line to plug a gap that is widening by the hour. Looking ahead, the next 72 hours will be critical. Ukrainian forces are preparing a series of localized counterattacks designed to cut the remaining Russian units off from their last supply routes. If these counterattacks succeed, the pocket will become a cauldron, and the trapped Russian forces will have only two choices: surrender or perish. International humanitarian organizations are already preparing for a mass prisoner exchange, though the logistics of handling thousands of captives are daunting. For Ukraine, the victory is bittersweet. The joy of the battlefield's success is tempered by the knowledge that Russia will eventually adapt. The hunting methodology that worked so brilliantly today may not work tomorrow. The enemy learns, the enemy evolves. But for now, on this day, April 2nd, 2026, the world has witnessed something extraordinary. A smaller, more innovative force has used intelligence, technology, and courage to destroy a larger, more powerful adversary. The armor massacre on the Ukrainian plains will be remembered as the moment when the myth of Russian invincibility was not just challenged, but utterly, irrevocably shattered. And as the sun sets on the burning wrecks of the Russian columns, the question is no longer whether Ukraine can survive. The question is how far the hunters will pursue their fleeing prey. There is no escape. There is only the field, the fire, and the final reckoning.